Thank you, Justine. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted, really delighted to moderate this session. We're now moving into the more technical aspects of the symposium. Very much looking forward, and I'm delighted to have a panel of real specialists in their own field. Starting with Joel Botai, is that how I pronounce your name? So Joel, he's from the South African Weather Service. He's 15 years of experience working on Earth systems observations and also atmosphere science. He is an extraordinary staff at the University of Pretoria, so we're in your campus here, but also an honorary research fellow at the School of Agriculture at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So welcome, sir. Very much, it's a great pleasure to have you. Then we have Danielle Shenzul, who's our data and resilience specialist at the humanitarian office, isn't it, now? Have you moved to Geneva already, or not yet? Yeah, okay, good. So Daniel has a BA at the University of Columbia and has done his PhD at Brown University, very prestigious institutions, and he's specializing in vulnerability and adaptation. I also noted that you co-authored 2 books and co-authored and authored a large number of peer-reviewed articles. Angela, last but not least, Baschieri, associate professor, former associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. You worked with our friends at UNICEF in Ethiopia as research and evaluation specialist. And before joining UNFPA as DFID, you were with DFID as health and population advisor. Very nice to have you here. Now, we also have colleagues online. Who is from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? I see a silhouette and many computers around her. Hello. Are you Fleur or Wiebke?
I'm Wiebke Bender, the Associate Program Officer of the United Nations Climate Change Office.
Okay, excellent. Nice to meet you, and I'll be calling you on you shortly, if that's okay. Can you hear us and everything?
Yes, I can hear very well. Thank you.
Okay, good. So, we'll start off with Joel Botai. Now, the climate patterns, really. I mean, you with the meteorological service, which is what some of us love to look at on our phones as we get up. So what is the current situation like in Africa? And then maybe move on to give us some scenarios in terms of the impacts that we are going to see in Africa.
Okay, thanks a lot, the program director. First, let me say that I know I was given a very short time. It's not the time I anticipated. I had to mute a number of issues or slides. So this presentation I was asked to give by the regional office for Africa, WMO, and I thought, okay, this is a unique group. This is a unique group, so I spent a lot of time looking at what material I should present here. But anyway, I have a short introduction to the talk. And then the most important part is where I intend to give a holistic view of climate science, preferably in the African context, but also provide some results of projected climate extremes. This is strictly based on the IPCC special report that was released last year, just to give some patterns that they alluded to. I didn't want to deviate because these are the same results and they have authority to present them. And then the WMO sent me some material on climate change impacts and gender, so I have one slide on the same. And I have a graphic illustration of my concluding remarks. But perhaps most importantly, let us refer to the 13th report of the World Economic Forum, which alluded to what the key risks and the impacts and the likelihoods. And here you will notice that extreme weather events are topping in the list, as you can see. And of course, the other aspect that you need to get notice of is our failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation tops again towards at the upper quadrant. As you can see that it's both, there's high likelihood as well as the impact is very high. But having said that, it's important we underscore the fact that society is faced with disasters which are caused by weather, water, and climate extremes. We know very well of what the tropical cyclones are doing to us, severe storms, heat waves. But these effects manifests as significant loss, of course, in the life and socio-economic. But the severity and frequency of such hazards are been noted or reported in the literature to be increasing. And this affects especially the developing and least developed countries. So going to the second slide, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the most important hazards are weather and climate related, and the distribution is very clear here, that flooding, which constitutes a large percentage of 36%, a drought, you'll see that, as well as drought and storms. Those are key. And extreme temperatures, those are emphasizing that these extreme events are particularly affecting Africa. And you know, Africa, we have three major ones: droughts, flooding, and the heat waves. So the fatality rates in Africa, especially in East Africa, due to droughts, is quite high, and as well as the storms, especially in the Indian and Pacific highland and coastal areas. Sorry. So again, to emphasize this aspect of the vulnerability of Africa is our recent weather phenomena that are affected a lot, and this is the Idai. And it's important to emphasize here that Idai is actually the worst in Africa. It's reported to be the worst in Africa and the second worst in the southern hemisphere. It's actually it just drawn a lot of attention from all Met services. We've put a lot of energy to try and understand whether systems caused this and whether our infrastructure were able to capture the systems properly. And the results will be reported very soon. But coming to the climate science, I think I would like the colleagues to pay attention to these cartoons. First, a future view of climate science is basically looking at what our historical observations are, what is in the past, what is in the present, and what is in the future. But looking at that alone cannot be able to help us develop what we call adaptation, a proper or an appropriate adaptation route that will help the community or society meet the climate resilience standards. So we are proposing that for us to have a holistic view of climate change, first you have to understand your historical climate, be able to also understand your present before you look at your future. And to do this, if you look at the curve that transcends to the future, if you are at the timeline of 2018, you'll notice that the risk is amplified. But if you are at 2018 and you project the future, the risk is quite magnified. But if you roll through, you evolve together, you will notice that the risk keeps on declining a little bit. So that is the model we could like to propose here. And this is what we refer to as the rotating climate-sensitive route. Basically, what this says is that you use historical observations and observe the present environmental parameters that will help you understand your climate, your present climate. But you will be updating this climate records, for example, extremes, frequencies, and align them to the forecast. Remember, as we said here, we also do some future projections. So you use your present records, past records, and try to correct your forecasts. Go back, analyze how the forecasts, how the impacts are on society, and how the forecasts are doing, whether they are okay or not. So the accuracy of those forecasts can be adjusted if you go back to the historical records. And as you can see, that circle actually rotates as you move ahead. And that is what we call the rotating climate-sensitive route. So climate adaptation can only be achieved, and that is our statement, following a sustainable rotating climate-sensitive route, which is based on good observations, regular updates, risk assessments, plus a response planning to observed weather and climate events. So this is important because then you are able to align your weather forecasts, seasonal predictions, and climate change projections. So this rotating climate model is a little bit more realistic than projecting a future risk at the present time. So we recommend that rotate or evolve with the system as you go along with this in time. So this graphic here demonstrates the distribution of observed trends, that is the spatial distribution of observed trends in the annual average temperature, that is from 1960 to 61. And you can see there is a clear marked differences in how the different countries have these trends. You'll notice some countries, some regions, especially the southeastern, or if you look at the northeastern part, they are elevated trends. Central Africa is average trends. The southern part, especially in Namibia and Botswana, the trends are a little bit significant. And you will notice in the future projections that Botswana, Namibia actually is a hotspot. It's identified as a hotspot for climate change. So, but it's important to look at the science versus policy interface. What governments have agreed to do. For example, the Paris Agreement and the earlier presenter mentioned about the nationally determined considerations. The statement here is that these are not binding agreements, as already alluded to. And then the only option we have is what we have, what we call the representative concentration pathway of 2.6. That is the only hope we have. So the targets that are alluded to, that is in order to have 1.5 degree warming, it's only at RCP 1 or 2.6, and that is a bit stringent. So coming to the characteristics of the extreme future climates, I've tried to categorize here based on the report, the special report, IPCC spatial report, that is West Africa, West and Central Africa. Most importantly, I think, is that the West and Central Africa is identified as a climate change hotspot. That is the message. That's the most important message there. If you go to East Africa, the most impact that we'll notice is that the reduced precipitation, as well as consecutive dry periods and consecutive wet periods. Those will increase and decrease respectively. The agriculture sector is noted to be the most impacted for that area. For the Southern Africa, I think the most important impact here is the decrease in about 10 to 20% in the amount of precipitation available. So the models that are showing that consecutive dry periods and consecutive wet periods increase and decrease respectively. The area is projected to rise in temperature and evapotranspiration. This will be translated into the 5 to 10% stream flow reduction in the Zambezi region. And coming to a regional case, that is Southern Africa, we have done a lot of analysis on the drought characteristics. Here we have set the 4 specific global warming levels at 1.5, 2.0, 2.5, and 3.0 degrees above the pre-industrial level. And the results show that the magnitude of the projected drought index, that is the frequency and the intensity, is going to increase considerably. That is, all the models show that. Sorry, all the models show the same. Sorry, I thought I was a bit clear. But coming to the last slide, that is the WMO contributions. They have alluded to 2 conferences that were organized. That is the gender dimension of water and climate services, as well as the Greater Horn of Africa Climate Outlook Forum. In both conferences, they have raised awareness of the gendered impacts of weather and climate. This is actually, for me, the first time I heard about it, and I was interested to try and develop products on the same. I'm very impressed about this. This is gendered impacts of weather and climate. This is a unique term. So, and they have also alluded to developing good practices of empowering women and men to build resilient societies through the provision and use of gender-sensitive climate information, weather and climate information. And in both conferences, the health sector was well represented. They have provided some mitigation strategies and approaches. And one is to look at gender-sensitive research that is needed. That is one of the strategy that is needed to better understand the health implications of the impacts of weather and climate and the associated policies. And lastly, large-scale capacity development, in particular targeting educational programs, or targeted educational programs, to train specialists who can then merge the specific health and wealth needs of men and women. And of course, raising awareness among the health professionals. So I felt that maybe I conclude with this graphic, and I hope that everyone will be able to see the cartoon. It speaks volumes. But in the World Economic Forum, they have come up with an initiative of 2 degrees of transformation. And they have said businesses are coming together to lead on climate change. And the question is, will you join them? And 1.5. Yes. And then the cartoon at the top left, anybody can infer what it says? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A warm round of applause, sir, and thank you for introducing us to the rotating climate-sensitive route, which is always nice to learn new things. But I really appreciated the slides on the interface between climate, the science, and the policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not like we didn't know, or that we wouldn't know, and that we won't know in the future. I think these predictions and projections are very, very clear. And I think in each and every of our countries where we work and live, we do feel it. So I'll go straight to the next speaker, who is, as I said, Daniel Schenzel from our HQ. And Daniel will give us two overviews. The first one is the fits between Cairo, Rio, the Agenda 2030 and Paris. And then the second thing, you're going to give us the basics regarding adaptability and resilience building in communities. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here and to be part of this sort of resurgence of climate change in the ICPD community, and a recognition that these issues are fundamental and vital. You know, I want to thank Dr. Bataille for, you know, giving us some of these projections, and I think we see these a lot. And you know, sometimes the reaction is depression. Sometimes the reaction is denial. But I was really inspired by our panel this morning, because their reaction has been action. And I think that's really what brings us together here, is to act and contribute and address these challenges. So a bit of background. We are well into the understanding, human understanding of climate change and its drivers. A few years ago, the fifth assessment report came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's sort of foremost recognized body of scientific expertise on climate change. And this was really a major step forward. It established at a high level of certainty human contribution to changing the global climate. It made the point that the more we disrupt our climate, the more impacts will come. And in fact, that they've already come and will continue to increase, and that we need to recognize and act on this. And it also made the point that the future is not set in stone, that we can address and still solve these challenges. To speak a bit also about the 1.5 degrees report, this was very sobering. Basically, member states asked the IPCC to assess what the impacts would be of just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in terms of average temperature. Because for a long time, the global negotiations had set the threshold at 2 degrees, but especially small island developing states and others were concerned that this was not indeed aggressive enough. And we did see, first of all, that this is around the corner. We're not looking at 2080, we're not looking at 2200, but we're looking at, on a time scale of 10, 15, 20 years, that we're going to see potentially this change. And we can delay that through aggressive efforts to reduce emissions, but it's probably coming. And that, as we saw from Dr. Bataille's presentation, that indeed the risks of just 1.5 degrees of warming are very, very significant to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, economic growth, and security. They are, however, worse for 2 degrees, and worse for the path that we are currently on, which is upwards of 3.5, 4 degrees potentially by the end of the century. So again, the message is we must prevent the worst occurrences of climate change, but we also need to adapt to the impacts that we know are coming. I want to give you a little bit of the timeline of how things have progressed from an ICPD and a climate change perspective. So really things started to take off in the late 80s. We had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body. In 1992, we had in Rio, the Earth Summit, which really brought climate change and sustainable development to the forefront of the global agenda, and initiated the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, thanks to our colleagues who are online, which began this process of negotiating global agreements on climate. We also, ICPD really stemmed directly from Rio. Rio was about placing people at the center of sustainable development. The ICPD Program of Action in 1994 in Cairo was about ensuring that people's rights and health, women's rights and health, would be prioritized in the context of our massive environmental, economic, and social problems and challenges that we face. 1997 brought the first agreement on emissions reductions, the Kyoto Protocol. This was for developed countries only, and not all signed on. Most prominently, the United States was not a signatory to this convention, but it was the first greenhouse gas emissions reduction treaty. Then in 2007, as that treaty was beginning to come to an end, there was an effort to negotiate a new, much broader, more comprehensive treaty. First, it failed in Copenhagen in 2009, but then eventually there was success in Paris in 2015. In 2014, we saw ICPD renewed until its full objectives could be achieved. So it was a 20-year program that's been renewed in perpetuity to achieve all its aims. And now here we are 5 years later, coming up on the Nairobi summit after the agreement of the 2030 agenda. And I think, if we step back from this a little bit and look, we can see an evolution of how climate change has been understood in society. So the first wave of it was really about what's called mitigation. We've heard this term today already. It's the reduction of the production of greenhouse gases and the expansion of what are called sinks. Let's say forests and other ecosystems that absorb carbon from the atmosphere. Put less carbon out into the atmosphere, absorb more carbon in. This is when we see the Amazon burning, we see one of the world's most important carbon sinks beginning to be eliminated and indeed releasing carbon at the same time. By the 2000s, we knew this was insufficient, that the pace of mitigation of greenhouse gas reductions was not sufficient, and that we needed to now recognize that climate change impacts were coming, and that we needed to adapt, to adjust ourselves and our societies, our households, our countries, and our plans to recognize that impacts would be different, and that we needed to plan and prevent the worst of those from really disrupting society. And by the 2010s, this most recent wave, we've now really fully tied together these issues and recognized that the entire concept of sustainable development, the entire concept of the project that we're doing to improve the human circumstances is fundamentally about climate change as well. So we see climate change in the 2030 agenda. We see social and economic and health issues in the Paris agenda. We see all of this in the context of disaster risk reduction in Sendai. So this is a convergence of the world's development agenda. And where's ICPD? How can we make sure that ICPD is connected to and part of this? And why do we need to do it? So we've heard a bit about ICPD, about the fundamental shift that it represented from large-scale population numbers to health, rights, and choices, including with regard to the environment. And when we would think, Benoit spoke very well about this in the first panel, that when we think about the issues of population growth, about large-scale human footprints on the earth, nonetheless, it's still about human rights and human choices. And that's our entry point and our action point for making impact in that area. And even then, even if we didn't know it at the time, key aspects of climate resilience were present. And we'll talk that's really what this symposium is about: gender equality and empowerment, education, health, rights, migration, and displacement. These are all pillars of ICPD. But it hasn't been included very much, certainly in the negotiations. From the population perspective, for some issues around historic human rights abuses associated with population control, making women especially and their health and their rights bear the brunt of collective plans around population targets. But also this divide between, who emits and where population is growing. So a lot of the challenge in the climate negotiations has been that the historical emitters are different than the current and future emitters to some extent. There's a growth in the developing world, certainly in terms of who's emitting, but also this is a big fault line, and one of the things that the negotiations had to address, and this issue of population fell squarely in the fault line, so it didn't appear. From a sexual and reproductive health perspective, there's not a lot of awareness about the connections, and that's another thing we're here to address this week. The communities have not been very well connected, the sexual and reproductive health and climate change communities, although there's been enormous efforts from actually many of the people in this room, indeed, to connect them. And that also there's a huge issue of general polarization around sexual and reproductive health and a desire to keep it out of climate change discussions. But even so, the entry points are there. Gender, health, human rights are very strong parts of the climate negotiations. And from a population and development perspective, member states have come together and frequently addressed climate change in their outcomes. I'm coming to the end, and I want to talk a little bit about, the extent of what we face. I think, we've heard the projections. These are hard to grasp, I think. I find it hard. In some ways, maybe it's my failure of imagination, but to really grasp how extreme and significant the change to the world will be. Here's a good visual. Applying all over the world, from changing precipitation patterns to higher temperatures, heat island effect in cities, so that heat waves will be extreme. There'll be areas where there are non-livable days, where you can't go outside in the future. More droughts and wildfires, changes to the oceans, changes to our food production systems. It's across the board. And, we can't do disaster risk reduction in the context of these kinds of changes. You can't go disaster by disaster because there's too much that's going to change. We have to see the change as a change in a systemic way that we operate. And I think the core of ICPD is to recognize that, when people are capacitated, when they're empowered, when they have their rights, when they have their health, especially as we heard from our inspired speakers this morning, when it's the people who have been marginalized but are at the very center, women and girls, marginalized communities, when they have the resources that they need, our communities, our households, our societies become much more flexible, much more adaptable, much more ready and able to change. And when we see a sea change in the way our world operates, the only way we'll be ready for that is some of the core investments from an ICPD perspective in education, in health, in rights, in our ability to migrate and to have supports in that context. Without the ICPD investments, our populations will not be ready and able to equip to adapt to the changes that will come. So as we look to areas to strengthen over the course of the next several days, we must begin, of course, with scaling up the implementation that many of the people in this room have been doing, to do more on the ground. We need new partnerships. We need to think about what avenues there are to introduce small measures in the intergovernmental negotiations to consider some of these issues. What do we need to take things forward better? What do we need in terms of resources, financing? That came up more. And how to take the energy and the mobilization and leadership in the ICPD community that's always driven action and drive climate action as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So it isn't a hoax from China? Thank you very much for the stark reminder, really, about the realities and where we're at right now, way beyond right, the 1.5% of global warming. I really like the term that you used, the convergence of the international community and of the development agendas, isn't it? I'd like to move straight on to the next speaker, who is joining us, I guess, from Bonn. Wiebke, are you?
Yes, that's correct.
With us? Okay, Wiebke, very nice to hear you. From the Climate Change Framework Convention Secretariat, if you could just give us a brief overview of the main policy instruments, but specifically what we're really looking for now is the entry points. The entry points when it comes to gender and also health and specifically SRHR programming. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me. Thank you, Anna. And good morning to the room, which I cannot see, but I've heard some laughter and also some of the engaging discussions before in the session. I'm very happy that we were invited to speak to you today about gender and climate change under the convention and how it relates to SRHR. Another objective for my presentation is to leave you with a better understanding of how what type of problem we are facing with climate change, but also how working on gender equality and women and girls empowerment, also in the area of sexual reproductive health and rights, can actually contribute to the just solutions that are needed for addressing this issue. If we could move to the next slide, or slide 2. Okay. While the audience at this symposium is by now very well aware of the climate crisis, thanks to the presentations by Joel and Daniel, it bears repeating often and loudly in different fora, as well as to ourselves, that we have no more time for delaying on action on climate change. I also want to reiterate the IPCC's 1.5 report's conclusion, which was already mentioned as well, that while it is still achievable to reach this goal, it is necessary for us to make rapid and radical transitions away from business as usual on a pathway towards climate neutrality, as well as just and climate resilient economies and solutions. We have to understand climate change as a threat multiplier, meaning that it worsens environmental pressures, but also social and economic pressures, leading to social upheaval and possibly even violent conflicts. And climate change, as we've heard before, does increase risks related to health, biodiversity, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth. In other words, everything. If we could move to the next slide, please. The issue then of how climate change impacts on vulnerability and resilience was also considered in the 5th assessment report by the IPCC. And it was found that inequalities, such as those experienced due to the discrimination based on gender, but also other societal inequalities such as age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc., are exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. This year also, the UNFCCC Secretariat, or UN Climate Change, prepared a synthesis report on the differentiated impacts of climate change and on women and men, based on submissions that were made by parties and UN, NGO, and civil society organizations. And the data provided in these submissions also confirmed the findings of the IPCC. When we talk about vulnerability in this context, we need to remember and to highlight that this vulnerability of women and girls is not some inherent quality due to the fact that they were born female, but rather it's a result of discriminatory patriarchal laws, norms, customs, and institutions, which then result in women and girls being excluded from participating in decision-making and community processes, having limited access to resources and assets, having an unequal burden of informal, unpaid domestic and care responsibilities and work, and also a limited access to sexual reproductive health care, for example, in natural disaster situations, being exposed to gender-based harassment, violence, and forced early marriages, as well as impoverishment, including when a male spouse migrates or otherwise leaves the household. We can move to the next slide on the Paris Agreement. Yes, thank you. So the question then is, what is the international community doing about this? In 2015, when world governments signed the Paris Agreement, they agreed to keeping global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, aiming to do what's necessary to keep it at 1.5. And we've already heard, thanks to Daniel, about the devastating effects of climate change. I just want to highlight a few of what it means, where the importance lies between the 1.5 scenario and the 2.0 scenario. It's the difference of this half degree is from 100% increase in flood risk to 170% increase in flood risk. It also means the difference between ice-free summers in the Arctic every 100 years versus every 10 years. It means 9% of the global population being exposed to extreme heat events at least every 20 years, to 20% of the population being affected. That's 2 billion people. It also means the difference between 70% of our coral reefs being lost by the next century versus virtually all coral reefs having disappeared. And every half degree of warming also leads to consistently lower yields, but also consistently lower nutritional value in tropical regions. So looking at these facts, it becomes clear that the half degree matters, especially to those people and communities in small island developing states and least developing countries. Which leads us to the international recognition of gender as a critical element to consider when designing and implementing climate change policies. And it also leads us to the next slide on gender under the UNFCCC. I won't go into too much detail for this slide, but you can see here a brief history of gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment under the UN FCCC. The Climate Change Convention was the only of the Rio Conventions that did not integrate gender from the start, and we saw the first decision on gender in 2001, which merely focused on the inclusion of women in the process, meaning in the negotiations. Then it took a good decade for the other milestone to be hit, which was the inclusion of a standing gender agenda item under the COP's agenda. And from there, we moved on to to a focus also on gender responsive climate policy and action. A work program on gender was established, then extended, and also complemented through a gender action plan. You can see in 2015 that the Paris Agreement was reached. In the Paris Agreement, we saw the integration of human rights-based language, as well as in the preamble, a focus on gender equality or recognition of gender equality as being essential to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as well as a right to health being recognized. This timeline doesn't show the entire history of gender under the UNFCCC, as there are now over 80 references to gender, women, or socially responsible climate policy within the Convention and the Paris Agreement. But most of these references describe the what, so they describe the desirable outcome. If we can move to the next slide. In 2017, which I've already mentioned, the parties agreed the first ever gender action plan under the Lima Work Program, which then provided the how. This is a 2-year gender action plan, and it runs until the end of this year, and there will be a review to consider next steps at the next Climate Change Convention in Chile in December this year. The gender action plan categorized all of the existing mandates on gender into 5 priority areas, and then included activities which were aimed at enhancing the implementation of such mandates. I won't go into a lot of detail, but if you can have a brief look at the priority areas, they are capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication, gender balance, participation and women's leadership, coherence across the UNFCCC and UN, gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, and monitoring and reporting. If we can move to slide 7, please. So for parties to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, national climate plans, including what are known as national adaptation plans or NAPs, and nationally determined contributions, also known as NDCs, are developed, communicated, and regularly adjusted. As was previously highlighted, the climate crisis affects all aspects of our human existence. So for these climate plans to be effective, an integrated approach is required, both horizontally and vertically. From an SRHR perspective, this then means, for instance, the inclusion of health and gender ministries in coordination structures. A further cornerstone of the national climate plans are stakeholder consultations, and this constitutes another entry point for local and regional SRHR actors to contribute their perspectives and insight to the process. If we could move to the slide on the Paris Agreement, slide 8. So parties under the UNFCCC have committed to implementing gender-sensitive and gender-responsive climate policies and plans, and we are seeing that they are actually increasingly working towards an integrated approach, for example, by employing gender budgeting. There's also a UNDP NDC support project, and under this project, currently 16 countries are working to integrate gender into their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. As part of this process, Zambia, for instance, identified health as a priority sector and carried out a gender analysis. At the national level, then, SRHR professionals can use the existing gender mandates as well as the processes under the NDCs and the NAPs to communicate on and as well as ensuring the consideration of SRHR as a critical both to gender equality, but also as being critical to comprehensive, effective, and just climate policy and action. Just to give you a brief insight into the timeframes, NAPs are not prescriptive in terms of development timeframes, and the first revision of the NDCs for all countries is due in 2020. I will now briefly, I see that I'm close to reaching the 12-minute mark, and I don't know when you're planning to break for lunch. I'll just briefly go through the examples that I have prepared from the African context on what we see are some examples of action that's already being taken.
Wiebke?
Yes.
If you could just try and wrap up within the next 2 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll try to do that. Okay. So the first example I'd like to introduce is Ethiopia, which is one of 13 developing countries and one of 6 African countries that have submitted their NAPs to the UNFCCC. And they've actually identified health as one of the vulnerable sectors and included the Department of Health in the institutional coordination. There was also comprehensive sector-based resilience and adaptation strategies that were developed, including the health sector. And while SRHR is not specifically mentioned, there are references to building social protection and livelihood options of vulnerable people, including women. In Liberia, we see that they have not submitted their NAP to the UNFCCC, but in the process of developing this plan within a UNDP and GCF-funded project, they have worked on guidelines how to integrate gender in national and sectoral adaptation plans. Now, the GCF is part of the financial mechanism, and there's a provision for integrating gender in GCF-funded projects, which can be seen in this case because guidelines were developed and they include reference to gender-related regulations and policies, in this case also specifically mentioning SRHR policies. I'll skip over an example of South Sudan, who have not yet submitted their NDCs, but include in their INDCs the identification of the health sector, as well as they also recognize the gender equality and human rights approach. So this is just as an insight for SRHR practitioners and local and regional actors to see how they can identify entry points. The last example that I wanted to introduce, I will skip over because I know that you will have the chance to hear from the project implementers themselves. It's an initiative called the Worth Initiative that was established by Arrow and the Danish Family Planning Institution at the latest COP in Katowice. But it is one very concrete example how local initiatives can potentially inform national climate planning. So I would like to really invite you to have a look at this project and to listen to their input. Wrapping up, I'll return to the message that I started with, which is that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities and impacts every aspect of our economies and societies, also then including, of course, sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we must take into account the impacts of climate change when considering sexual and reproductive health and rights, but we must also consider and communicate on how addressing existing gender gaps will ensure better climate outcomes. I hope I just barely hit that 2-minute goal. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this topic. And if you would like to find out more information, you can visit our web pages, which are also on the last slide of this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wiebke. Can you hear the applause all the way to Bonn?
Thank you very much.
Is there any?
I can.
Is there any chance maybe to turn around a little bit so that we can see your face?
It will be a sideways silhouette, I'm afraid.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. No, this was really, really important because you can't emphasize enough the importance of the Gender Action Plan and how it's actually implemented, what the entry points are, and it will be very interesting for us really to see within, as members of UN country teams, how we are accessing and how we are integrated into the SDG fund, but also the Green Climate Fund. So we're going to explore that in the next hours and days. Last but not least, Dottore, Angela Baschieri. Angela will try to really connect the dots, right, and see where all of this fits together in a possible conceptual framework that links policy, programs, funds, and data.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, fantastic. So I think a lot of what has been, what I have in the presentation has already been discussed. So it's going to be, the time between us and lunch is going to be shorter. So, so what I want to discuss in this presentation is really what do we need to do and how we need to work differently. And how can we really then, if we were to access those funds, how are we going to write that kind of business case to donor to say we're going to do things differently, we're going to establish a new partnership, we're going to run different programs. And so the idea of this presentation is really thinking about solution. And each one of you has been invited here with the idea to contribute to that kind of narrative. And so hopefully in the next 2 days, we're going to come up with a set of joint recommendations that we can then say, okay, this is our kind of idea moving forward. And the reason why this meeting was organized at this time is because we want to make sure we didn't miss the opportunity of meeting in September and the upcoming meeting in Chile and so on. So it's really timely, this meeting, and I thank you, each one of you, for having the opportunity to allow to make your way here to be with us today. So a lot of the things that I've put here have already been discussed. What I wanted to go through is that the Agenda 63, the Africa Regional Forum, but there's been parts already been discussed in the previous presentation. Tap into the Addis Ababa Declaration on Population Development, that is the ICPD monitoring framework of whether we are moving towards the commitment of Cairo, and then thinking about the solution, which is a mini overview of what is coming in the next few days. So, no, sorry, this is going this way. So in Agenda 63, there is a recognition from member states that climate change is important, that there is the continent contributes only to 5% of the global emission, but it bears the biggest impact. So there is a recognition that Africa needs to move into action for adaptation. What is less clear is what needs to be done in the programmatic action. And I think that's where we need to kind of move forward on that. The Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development that happened in April this year. Again, a recognition from member states that the progress on sustainable development is going to be impacted by the impact of climate change. So we need to think about what should be the common Africa position in terms of climate change. So it's really about what should we do next and how should we change programming. So I think I'm going to go quite quickly on this few slides, but it's about the progress you have made so far and how actually progress on maternal health might, for example, be impacted by impact of climate change and impact of health systems, for example. So we know that we have made some progress on maternal deaths, but still need to be done on neonatal death, stillbirth, and we know that the impact of climate change has an impact on those. And so there will be opportunity in the next few days to discuss this specific aspect. We know that there is an impact, especially amongst the youth. I'm going to skip because I think we all know this. And the progress on GBV, we know that there is GBV still prevalent in many countries in the region, and we know that in recurrent crisis, the impact of the rate of GBV increases, and so there is one of the avenue of interaction. The Addis Ababa Declaration on Population Development had a clear overview of the impact of climate-related migration on the increase in urbanization. So it's recognized that climate change is a new emerging challenge, but there is no clarity about what should we do next. So that's kind of almost what triggered the thinking about this symposium and the idea, okay, what as a community, what can we do next, and how can we organize ourselves better? So the idea of this symposium is try to think about different avenue, and one aspect is to think about the individual and community aspect. So how you do a program to change the relationship, to reduce the vulnerability of communities. And we know, I think we have discussed extensively that there is an impact on vulnerability, but there's no clarity about how programs should be designed. And I think there will be an example in the next few days of solutions on how some agencies have a design program in an integrated manner across different partners, that include SRHR into resilient building type of programming. So there will be a session only on this, where we'll think about what takes to design a program differently, what are the elements of the program, what are the partnership, and I think it will come from you, what are the specific recommendations, why are we not doing those programs, how can we do those programs better. And so the next session after lunch will be exactly about this. So really, we will have a terrific example from a number of countries, from a number of agencies, and we're going to reflect and try to discuss what are the key recommendations on this. The other kind of tier of discussion is the health system. So moving from individual community, what are the health system responses? So we know that the building blocks of the health system, there is an impact on human resource. There are interesting examples, for example, from the government of the Seychelles, that they are designing the approach, a training program for health professionals to respond to the impact of climate change in small island state. So there are examples throughout the globe, and there will be a discussion in the session later on this afternoon about exactly these things. How to strengthen climate resilience system to deliver SRHR. Moving on, I think building on what was discussed from the UNFCCC, we know that the Gender Action Plan is now established area of work but what is not clear is how to include SRHR into those discussions. So how can we better integrate, and we will have a session where we'll have the opportunity to unpack and really think through why those dots had not been drawn yet. Then there is a kind of we know that climate change is basically the impact of recurrent crises, and we know those recurrent crises are not extreme events; they are recurrent. And if we take example of the graph from Malawi, we can see that in the last 10 years, those crises actually have been every 2-3 years, and so they are basically becoming the most the way of working. And this is our scenario, is our reality moving forward. And we know that in emergency crisis, there is increase in violence, increase in GBV, and all sort of migration and displacement. We will have a session where we will go through those issues and think through what are the recommendations. So if we were to have in mind how we would write a kind of a plan of action, what are the plan of action along those areas? We know that the youth has been, and I think this is the most exciting part of this work, that as Yola was highlighting this morning, is their reality that we are discussing. And so we can't discuss the reality without the youth. And we have a terrific example across the globe of very committed young teenagers that are really taking these issues on board. From Greta Thunberg, from Isra Hirsi from the US, from Yola from South Africa, and Elia from Uganda. They're all making strong commitment about what about their future. And so this is the reflection for us, that we had a similar reflection when we were back in the days discussing about gender. We need to mainstream gender, so we need to kind of mainstream the use of the youth into this kind of thinking about solutions. And so we will have a session where it's led by the youth. It's been designed by the youth, so it's going to be an exciting session tomorrow morning, and where we'll have the opportunity to go dive deeper about what is their view about what next. And then we need data. We need better data to know what we need to do and how to monitor program, how to design program, to assess what are the vulnerability. So we know that in standard vulnerability assessment, there's a number of definitions of vulnerability. We won't dive into that, but we will try to build on the issues of how to better integrate the aspect of GBV, of health, into standard vulnerability assessment. And so we will have a discussion with a key expert on how best to integrate those. And this builds on a previous workshop that happened a few months ago on this issue. So we are really kind of capitalizing on that. So that's bring me to kind of the kind of one suggestion on how we could look at those at all of these aspects together in terms of delivering the promise of Cairo. So we need policy, and some of this session will discuss policy, so I don't want to use too much time on the discussion, because I think it's important here to think about what are the entry points. we need programs, and we discuss program in the next few days. And hopefully we get to Wednesday morning to know how to access fund and what are the opportunity for financing. And then the first session will be really about what we need to do to empower young population, to have a more empowered young people, have better resilient self-system, and ensure that we reduce the risk and more prepared for emergency. And the building blocks will be data, so making sure that we have data. So this is kind of one way to think through about the next few days and our discussion. And so the outcome of this symposium, so I hope that you will stay with us, engage in the next few days, because we are working. It's not a symposium where we are sitting down. We are working together, and what we want is to have recommendation and some compendium of the solution. And some will be discussed here, some other we need to kind of get them think about what needs to be integrated and think about what are the partnership and financial opportunities. So that's the next step.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes before lunch. These were very dense, technical, substantive presentations. My initial inclination would be to step back and let this settle over lunch, and then maybe see in the afternoon as we go into the more practical presentations that we can then come back to the various speakers to see where they think there would be entry points. But let us have maybe a couple or 3 questions before we go for lunch. I see our representative in Lesotho, the person from WITS, right? And please remind me your name. And Nagash. Okay, right. So maybe Mark, do you want to start? If we can have a microphone.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry, the microphone went that way. Hold on one second, if you don't mind. Mark, yeah, why don't you start?
Brief, yeah, I don't want to spoil people's appetite also, but thank you very much for the contribution from the panel members. My intervention was really about being in Lesotho. You make the link with climate change, El Nino, drought. So I was looking, when I was in the country, on the real evidence which we have on an impact on sexual and reproductive health. And when Julita came also, we discussed about one of their partners. They said, yeah, it has an impact on child marriage. So I started to look where is our real evidence beyond anecdotal observations or local level reports. And unfortunately, there is very little. I spent 2 days looking at ResearchGate, which is a well-recognized database. I had my daughter spending a day in the library of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but very little comes out. Dr. Botai, you mentioned further research into gender and health, but overall what I found is very little evidence of climate change, drought, and health in general. The only thing what we find, or the only link which we find, is mental health. Mental health farmers, Australia, mental health people in the US. I worked in India also. Suicide rates amongst farmers there is very high. So my observation or my question towards the panel is much more, shouldn't we be more investing in evidence? Angela, clear, you make a business case data, but I'm talking really about accumulating real evidence. Why? Just to give you an example again, a population-based HIV measurement or analysis in Lesotho looked at HIV and drought, and they looked at drought in correlation, and I couldn't find any. Now, I agree with everything which has been said this morning, but this is because of the design of their study. So the question is really, shouldn't we be investing a little bit more in that level of evidence and set up long-term, longitudinal analysis? Thank you.
Next, please. Next question.
If you look on the website of the plan for the IC...
Hold on. We need a microphone, please.
So if you look at the program, or the themes for ICPD in Nairobi, there's 5 and none of them mention or allude to climate change, which is a bit surprising. I can project, so, and I wondered practically for that conference, is there text that is a program of action for going forward that people can comment on, and perhaps that's something the meeting could do to look at that relevant text and have a look.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nagesh?
I appreciate their presentation and taking to 1994 what ICPD expected from your presentation, all of you. Are we meeting our expectation? If we see the reality, still the population dynamics issue in its true sense is not being addressed with developmental issues in a right way. How do you see it? Even the sexual reproductive health rights, including the right, many governments, many countries are retreating. So after 25 years, how do we evaluate this process? Even the presentation from the NFCC, I heard from gender perspective. What about from population dynamics perspective? Why not you analyze from that angle? Why are you only focusing on gender? Yes, I appreciate gender should be addressed in that way, but why not the population dynamics is my concern.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, Angela, please, on research maybe?
On research, yes. So why there is not much research? So I would ask the question on how would you do the research? So when you want to establish the link between climate variability, which normally is defined as a 30-year average, so the change of 30-year average, and an impact on health outcomes. So just to give you an example of a systematic review that I've done on impact of climate change on child health. So I did together with Sari Kovat from the London School. She's an expert. She actually part of the one of the chapter on the IPCC. And so what we did a systematic search of all the key terms on climate, on temperature and rainfall. So you would have to have 2 points. You have to have the change in temperature and the change in rainfall. And then at the same time on health outcomes. Unfortunately, when we scan all public available research database, we got around 7,000 papers. We checked all the abstract. We cut down to 700. From them, we then established what is a specific parameter of impact. So from that, we cut down to 42 papers. The majority of papers are the impact on malaria. We have some papers that shows the impact of drought. But the impact of drought is very difficult to establish because the impact of drought on child health has an impact via child nutrition and by the impact of the peak in prices of grains. So it's an indirect impact. So to establish actually an impact is not easy because you would have to kind of create a DACA framework. We will have in a session on the health system session, Matthew will actually dive on those type of analysis for maternal health. And so we will see what it takes to do research. And unfortunately, it's not easy to establish those links numerically because it is a question of linking the weather patterns and health outcomes. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the challenge is to speak the same language and understanding the variables that we are both putting together in the model.
Has, on the last question, maybe because you have the microphone as a population specialist, has it fallen off the wagon?
No, I think there is the challenge is what is the narrative about population dynamics and impact on climate change. I think the governor of Malawi made a clear kind of case for the importance of understanding population dynamic on economic development. And I think there's been a review of the National Adaptation Plan, and they found that very few adaptation plan had family planning or SRHR as a core component. There is more to do, but there is also more to understand what what are the potential pathway of impact, and I have that's kind of would be my.
Yeah. Daniel? Let's just go with the microphone
I've just
one
got
by
two
one.
comments on this. First, I think let's look at the partnership between WMO and WHO, how they have defined their research agenda. Maybe that's where you can trace how well you can define your research agenda between, or associating the impact of extremes, where the climate extremes on the health outcomes. And I agree with you that immediately the research, the literature on these associations does not exist, because we also, from the weather and climate, we are trying to create what we call applications research, and bringing in the health sector, the water sector, agriculture sector. In the health sector, we immediately see a lot of literature on malaria, this EC association. There are also infectious diseases like pneumonia and I think cholera. But there is another aspect that probably will be of interest with bringing the agenda is about biometeorology. We've poorly resourced farmers in the field being affected by heat stress because of farming in the and when we got the field, they are telling us straight that they have an impact on the amount of stress that they face because of elevated temperatures.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thanks. Some thoughts on to the questions. So on the evidence question, I mean, this convergence of climate and sustainable development, it creates enormous challenges for research, because the questions are too complicated and the pathways for linkages are too elaborate. But if the pathway of impact is that droughts are leading to greater poverty, if the pathway of impact is that economic diversification and flexibility within the household is an adaptive mechanism, if the pathway is that staying in school is a part of adaptation, if the pathway is avoiding or having safer, shorter-term displacement, these are pathways of impact, then those are areas where we do have a much stronger research base on the links between sexual and reproductive health, adolescence and youth, avoiding early pregnancy, avoiding child marriage, and how those become all more difficult in the context of economic stresses, and all kinds of different stresses. So I think, the gold standard of that beautiful study that connects all of the 18 different systems that you need to do in the context of the sweeping changes we expect is probably going to be difficult. But when we break it down into some of these pieces, there is quite a bit more, and I think it's on us as a community to compile that evidence in the different pieces following maybe elements of this framework. Look at the health system, look at the individual resilience mechanisms, look at the emergency response needs, and tie those in, and then have that evidence ready to be able to put forward in projects. Quickly on the population issues, I think what came out this morning very clearly is that there's a big difference between the global question of the world's population footprint and emissions and the local question. And so there's at the local level, one of the core tenets of ICPD is that when women in households have children that have more than desired fertility, it creates significant strain on the woman, on the household, on the community, and the truth is also at times on the local environment. And then the question is, how do you address that? And through the powerful rights-based, health-driven, individual-focused methods that we've all worked very hard on. So, population has been identified as a contributor to climate vulnerability in national adaptation plans, population trends. And the interventions can support that. I think that's a different question than at global scale, what Benoit was talking about earlier, to think about, trying to put the blame of climate change on population growth when the emissions have come from countries where population growth is very low or even starting to be negative. So we should remember that local phenomenon. I know that you and many others have worked on that, and we're going to hear a lot about that over the next couple of days. Thanks.
Thank you. For the specific question that was raised on the thematic area for Nairobi on climate change, if I'm looking at Julita, would you like to respond to that, and then we'll close it off.
Thank you. And now that I have the microphone, really just to say that it's been an excellent set of sessions and really very enlightening. In terms of the Nairobi summit, it is quite clear to us that indeed we will need to have an important session on climate change. And we have 16 what we call signature sessions that align to not only the 5 themes, but what we call accelerators. And within that, there is one on climate action. So what we're doing here in the next 3 days is also helping to sort of fine-tune that narrative and what we really want to be able to get out of that session. So I think this is a dry run for at least a 90-minute signature session that will take forward. Currently, and again, if you go on to the website for the Nairobi Summit, there are 17 global commitments that are out there for comments from countries, from partners, from communities alike. None of them at this point has one on climate action, but indeed, if we want, we can suggest. And there are opportunities to really mainstream the conversation around what we're looking at, particularly adaptability of communities and individuals, to actually make the case. So I'm confident that what comes out of here, if we can use it, we will mainstream it through the program. I think that's
Thank you very much.
And you can talk about
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are saying in UNFPA that spacing births is good. I can tell you that spacing food intake, the time between food intake, is also good, very good actually. So please do put it on me. I take responsibility for the delay. But I quickly hand over to Justine, who is going to tell us where we are eating.
Thanks so much. So thank you once again to all of our panelists. Excellent session. So we're going to break for lunch. Lunch is over in the restaurant as you leave through this door to your left. We will take an hour and we'll be back here for 2:10. See you then. Thank you very much.